everybody. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we're going to talk about the chapter in the Brown Enough text by Rivas, and the chapter's called The Ameri-con Dream, right? And really what we're talking about here is how the American dream is really this myth or this idea that is perpetuated in American society as something that, as long as you work hard enough, as long as you do the right things, as long as you say the right things, as long as you go to the right schools, whatever the caveat is, you will achieve this particular extravagant wealth or this unique set of financial securities and social hierarchy places that are just not accessible to the overwhelmingly mass majority of Americans. Okay. He and both I are going to talk a lot in this throughout this lecture and this chapter about how race is tied into this. But I also want to mention the fact that, especially because we're doing these lectures for Kentucky students in an education system that is built around students from Appalachia, this is also very relevant in a lot of ways to those from socioeconomic backgrounds, even white students, especially white female students from areas of extreme poverty, from areas or small rural towns that don't have that social network that can get you into those really Ivy Leagues or super high upgraded schools, right? Or even maybe the UKs of the world, right? And this is a particular conversation surrounding how both our education system and colleges and higher education debt is tied into this con that is the myth of meritocracy equals the American dream. And what I mean by meritocracy is this idea that, again, as long as you work really hard and you work to hone whatever skill it is you have, that you have something that is valuable in the work market. So obviously you're going to then succeed, climb up that economic ladder, that job ladder, and that's going to get you a financial level of wealth that leaves you both very comfortable, but also the American dream is to live in that excess, right? We've equated success to this European colonialistic version of success, which is really wrapped around this Western idea of money, of social capital, of social networking power. Okay. And generally, again, all of that is coming back a lot to wealth. Now, how this ties into race before we even get into college debt. So race relations in this country have left, as we've talked about in the chapter 9 and chapter 10 lectures, have left people of color specifically at a significant disadvantage historically to garner that family wealth or that inheritable wealth, right? And a lot of that falls down to, again, slavery, the genocide, and then leaving Indigenous persons with limited land and resources, the way in which we do immigration policy and how that impacts specific brown bodies in this country. And all of those things have collaborated in a way that historical wealth is not in the hands of persons of color, because they just haven't had the same kinds of generational chances to even possibly get that college debt and that college education and those higher up jobs. The people that you generally see touted as, celebrities who have, and we talked about this again a little in lecture 10, that have exceeded that wealth gap or are Black celebrities or that are breaking boundaries and that are making a good amount of money, or rappers that are really good in making a lot of money, or athletes that are making really good in making a lot of money. What this fails to what it says is that entertainment is the only form of category really where people of color can be massively successful and even achieve the American dream. And even that is a chance that's one in several million, right? Athletes or entertainers or musicians. And that's at the core of what the American dream really is. It is this this idea that everyone can achieve something that really there are very few spots for people to achieve. Capitalism is built on this idea of laborers needing to pit against each other, needing to work against each other, needing to strive for something. Otherwise, then you buck up against the system that you operate in, because the system you operate in gives you unfair chances. It doesn't allow you the options or the opportunities to actually achieve the things that it promises, right? And essentially, the American dream is a promise that you can't take to the bank, right? It's a promise that for the grand majority of us, we will never reach middle class. We will never reach even we will definitely never reach upper middle class. We're never going to reach that 1%. And that's not to say that I won't have some student at some point that is going to sit in a lecture and is going to take one of my classes and that is going to go and end up accomplishing that, because I can't guarantee that that's the case. And that hope is what keeps us all, chugging along and attempting to do that and taking massive steps, massive steps with great personal and financial risk in order to attempt that, right? One of the reasons, and I'm going to use a lot of personal vendettas in here, and then also going to talk about the corresponding ways in which even I, coming from a place of white privilege, where that white privilege has played out and even allowed me the opportunities to even get to the places that aren't very fabulous, right? And we're going to talk about that, right? I'm going to work through these steps, and I saw this puzzle piece and it was already part of the actual lecture, and I thought it was entertaining, and so I was like, I'm going to do this as like a steps as part of a puzzle, and then I'm going to make the last puzzle piece not fit. Why? Because the last puzzle piece is not it, because it's not something that we're getting there. It's not something that we're doing. And we're going to tie this into college debt. We're going to tie this into jobs. We're going to tie this into capitalism. And then we're going to tie all of that back into race. And I'm going to do that by essentially working through here with both the author's personal experiences, some of my own, and also then getting into why my own personal experiences, while still coming from a place that I'm not winning, because I have intersections of identity that leave me with oppressions, but that whiteness is not the reason why I'm not winning. And that I'm also going to talk about the ways in which people of color with the same intersections plus that would also be struggling probably much harder. Okay. And we're going to talk about that. Okay. So step one, and he talks about this at the very beginning. I have a crap ton of student loan debt. The author has a crap ton of student loan debt. Likely, most of my students that are sitting in this classroom are going to have a ton of student loan debt, right? And that's because students that are primarily students of color, that are students that are going into any kind of social work or social justice or field that has anything to do with teaching are going to have a crap ton of student loan debt, right? And they're not going into fields that are going to make a ton of money. They're just not. The students that I generally carry, and that's not to say that everybody's that way, but most of the students that are going to walk through my classrooms are not going to go on to degrees that are going to make them six figures plus even, right? And a lot of my students are also going to be sitting in a place just like I was, taking out grants, trying to get scholarships, taking out loans, right? And trying to get through college in the most cost affordable way, because you don't just have money to pay for an entire semester. Again, that's not to say I'm not going to have students in my classroom that have parents that do have the means to do that. And that's fantastic. And what I would want for those students is to sit in this lecture and to kind of think through how their opportunities, because they won't have that when they get out of school will be different than, say, mine or the author's or a person or another person of color, right? And we're going to talk through that a little more. A lot of people will tell you, and they've been preaching this to you probably since middle school. I mean, even my kid who's in fourth grade has a college prep course, like not course, but like trajectory in their, and they're doing this in elementary schools now. And I'm like, okay, well, that's fabulous, but college is not the only answer. And I'm saying this as a college professor, right? And I say that because we've been piping into people for so long that the only way you're going to make it in America is if you have a college education. And the problem with that is that college education is not accessible to the majority of America, right? And it's going to get even worse as college tuition continues to rise, and it has risen continuously, with little to no cost of living or pay increases to justify it. You're going to have higher education be able to reach less and less people. And what happens is essentially then it becomes, well, the reason you didn't make it is not because you went to higher ed, it's because you went to the wrong higher ed. So you have to go to the Ivy League schools or the best schools, the most expensive schools. And if you can't afford it, you better take out more loans so that you can still do it. And those myths, what they have done is Ivy League schools have traditionally really, really low diversity rates. Those are getting a little better, but they're not great. They have really, really, really low amounts of financial aid for persons of color, for persons from rural areas, even spots for people of rural areas. Because again, they're expecting students that go to certain high schools. They're expecting students with certain networking, social networking. And most of those things are coming out of very private high schools that are predominantly white, that are predominantly in urban environments in very key cities in the country, usually semi-close to the actual university itself, right? And that says something. It says, that the students that I teach, for instance, that are the majority not from these areas, are not at a place that is of the same level of value, that the education that they're getting that we can offer is so substantially less than you might get at Stanford or Harvard or whatever, that it's not worth the American dream. And that's inaccurate. But what it also is saying is that you, as a student, are then not worth paying what your value is once you get out. And that's where the problem lies, right? Because they keep spinning you all these stories about higher education and then adding those caveats after you've done it in order to justify still not paying you those increases, still not paying you the worth that you have. And then that leads to serious economic crisis, serious economic problems. All right. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. All right. So I love this metaphor that he uses. And he talks about an episode of Seinfeld where George has told somebody that he has a house in the Hamptons and that he inherited it. And so he's got family in, and so he's taken this lie all the way to where they're all driving in the car to see this Hamptons house that he knows he doesn't have. They know he doesn't have, and everybody's just riding in the car anyway. And he uses this as this metaphor about why people stay in the American dream, right? The people who run this con know it's a con, right? They know that the majority of us are not going to make it, yet they still perpetuate these same ideas, right? The people who run corporations, the people who run major businesses, the people who hold the top spots in politics, the people who hold the top spots in any field that you can think of, right? Whether it's entertainment, whether it's academics, whether it's what have you. I remember sitting down with a professor of mine in undergrad because I took the cheapest route possible and went to when I decided to go back because I didn't want to much debt. I still have debt to my eyeballs. Um, and I decided to go to a community technical school for the first part, and then go and transfer into EKU. And I did that specifically because I wanted to cut costs, not because I thought the education was less, because I didn't, not because I thought that I would be valued less as a student, because I shouldn't be, but because I knew that economically I was already going to be in a not fabulous place when I got out. And I wanted that to be at the least amount it could possibly be. But doing that in academics, I remember looking at my advisor, one of my advisors sitting in at BCTC, and having them look at me and say, I need you to understand that I know you want to be in academics, but you're never going to be in academics at a D1 school. You're never going to be in those six-figure academic roles. You're never going to be in that space. And I'm not saying that because you're not brilliant, because you are. I'm saying that because essentially the system is rigged so that we will stay in positions that essentially we ascribe to work past, and the ones that we ascribe to and that we have lived up and have beefed up to essentially make it to be that American dream, to enable us or to secure our futures and our future generations of our families, essentially are already being filled 3 generations ago by people who have had the resources to throw into the social networking, to throw into those Ivy League schools, to throw into the people that they knew afterwards, to get the roles and the jobs that I'm actively looking at and thinking, well, I could have a chance at that. Why wouldn't I? Just because I'm an academic that has this on my transcript doesn't mean I'm any less of an academic. Well, that may be true, but I probably won't get to the place in the hiring process that would allow me to even show that I have adequate ability to teach and to show knowledge, because I have certain because I have certain schools on my list and on my transcript. I wouldn't even be considered qualified for the job at a D1 school or an Ivy League school. And that in and of itself poses a problem, right? And then you add on, if I was a person of color, right? That in and of itself is going to set up another setup of barriers, mostly because of the economic, or mostly because of the hiring processes and just gross racial discrimination that happens in workplaces, right? And then you add the fact that, say, this person of color that has the same kind of background that I do and the same economic or same educational attainment, right, that I do, also has a kid that, like I do, that is medically complex and doesn't allow me to actually physically be in a classroom. I have to be working from online. I have at that point limited my ability to obtain work to my social capital. And while I love the university that I work for, absolutely love it, I also love it because I know the people and because I've worked with these people, because they were the academics that taught me how to be an academic, right? And that level of social capital, because they already knew me, allowed them to look at that transcript and say, well, I know this girl and I know what she's capable of. And that allowed me some of the positions I have. But without that, would I get the same positions? Probably not. That social capital has allotted me the ability to work in a way that actually makes sense for my family, for the things that we have to do. And it's interesting because when I read this chapter about college debt and about race, I do think about where, like, because I think about where I would also be without some of my intersections, right? If I wasn't a disabled person, if I didn't have a disabled or medically complex kiddo, if I was a white dude, if I was, if I had actually done this process when I should have, which would have been a solid 12 years earlier, right? When I was 18 and coming out of high school. If I was a person of color, how would all of these things impact where I am? If I wasn't a queer person, how would these things impact the jobs opportunities that I would have been given, the level of college I would have continued? Would I have gone on and got my doctorate and done it fairly quickly and been at a completely different place at 35? And that's okay. I think the problem here becomes A, we attribute success with achieving massive financial wealth. But B, also, we have to be able to figure out how education is affordable and to whom it's affordable for and why. And I think that really was the questions that I ended up having is what's going to happen if student loan debt continues to rise and we don't start forgiving debt? What's going to happen to the generation that I live in and the one before me and the one after me that essentially is drowning still in financial debt? I don't know anyone my age that went to higher education that is not still paying off their debt. And that's saying something, right? Because that carrying that for that long, and these are students that didn't do it like I did and go back when they were in their late 20s, right? This is people that went at 18 and have good jobs. Some of them are doctors, some of them are lawyers, and they still carry an exuberant amount of student loan debt. And then I think about the ways in which, like the Biden administration trying to do the student loan, and this is a perfect timing because this week the Supreme Court is actually working towards probably shutting it down. Or the idea of even having that bit of student loan debt relief for those who were allotted certain kinds of government funded loans, like that would be huge. And it would be huge for not just students like me that were non-traditional students, but also students and white students from rural areas. But amazing amounts of these students would be students of color. And that would go it would be an amazing step forward in understanding the historic roots of our economic system and how it has disenfranchised so many of our people of color in this country. All of our people of color in this country. All right. So, I also love that he talks about the conversation he had with his parents in this really nice letter that he wrote to them for Christmas. And then his dad's reaction was like, I'm paying all of this money for you to do it for us. Like, no, don't do it for us. You're going to hate it. Like, Pepper, no. And he's like, do it for yourself, because only if you do it for yourself are you going to actually get anything out or actually have a chance to succeed. And I do think that that's a really important message. And it's a really important message I will give to all of you as you're sitting in this classroom. If you are taking on all of this massive debt to do something that you are not going to be happy with or are not going to be capable of paying it back, it's okay to take a step back and wonder, is this the right choice for me? Because there are technical schools, there are work study programs, there are internships that allow you to work up in nonprofits if that's where you want to go. But also, I take this to also say, make sure your debt to job ratio is going to work, because I can tell you that I love being an academic. It is the thing I wanted to do since I started going back to school, right? I love research. I love academics. I love everything about education. I think it is entirely the step where I am meant to be and where advocacy starts. It's where good positions start. It's where change starts. Without education, we can't really do a whole lot of the rest of it, right? And yet I'm still going to look at you and say, an adjunct professor having as an adjunct professor with 3 different jobs at 3 different universities, working double the class load of any tenured faculty professor, because I have 8 classes a semester, I make not enough to be able to support my family and my medically complex kiddos. I have no insurance that's covered with that. And I have a master's degree and a heap ton of educational debt, right? And I think about that and I think, and I'm saying that with a smile on my face, but the smile is hiding all the anxiety, right? Like, but I also think about that in a way that talks about the realities that are our not just our education system, but also our work system, right? We live in a capitalist society. They need somebody to teach these classes that they can get in a whole bunch of adjuncts, not pay a tenured faculty position, not have to promote insurance, make sure that they're limited to 3 classes a semester. So they're still teaching, 9 hours a semester for us. And that's 3 classes that we only have to pay at a much less rate with no benefits, with still an extreme amount of educational attainment. And we're going to do that over and over and over again and keep adding adjuncts because it is much more cost effective for the university, and it makes at the bare brunt of it all, it makes the people in charge of the college more money. And so if they can make more money adding adjuncts like me as opposed to tenured faculty positions, then essentially they get to keep winning at that capitalist game, right? And that's the same way for not just education, it's the same way for so many. But what happens is you have a whole bunch of me's, and then you add also person of color coming out of their master's degree programs, coming out of their doctorate degree programs, and not finding spots in academia, not because they're not qualified, because they're absolutely qualified, but because they're limiting tenured faculty positions and moving them to adjunct faculty positions. And I can tell you, you can carry as much adjunct faculty positions as you want. You're still going to not make a living and you're still not going to be offered benefits. And that's the point, right? Like I have 2 kids, one of which is medically complex. And not having insurance is something that I lose sleep over at night. And it's something that we then have to use other resources to do that. And they thankfully have, their biofather has insurance that covers them. But if it was just, if like the rest of all of the things that they need were covered just by me, I had to figure out insurance too. I make slightly above what is necessary for social measures because I'm not technically that bad in what I make, but I also don't make enough but I still make so little that I qualify for loan deferment because they know I don't make what it is compared to my educational attainment. And I don't have any benefits. I would be paying well over a third, probably more than that, probably skimming closer to half of my income to pay for insurance for the kids and me, which is absurd, by the way. And we'll get to that. But the point here, and the point the author is trying to get at, is that so many of us who are well educated, especially those who are well educated, we struggle financially and we hide it from the people we care about. We hide it from the people that we love. We hide it from our family members who have helped us get to this place like he did, right? And we struggle and say that we're fine when we're barely making ends meet, or we're sleeping in our cars, or we're wondering how we're going to get our medicines the next month, or we're wondering how we're going to, like, we're not answering calls from numbers we don't know because they might be debt collectors, right? All of these things add up. And that leads to this kind of fear, this fear of living, this fear of what comes next, the fear of, are we ever going to be in a financially secure place? Did we make the right decision? All of these things. I also love this term that he brings up, which is called the also rans. And it's a horse racing term, as he described it. And we're from Kentucky. We love our horse races around here, for better or worse, mostly worse. But the also rans are essentially, you can only have one winner. So you also have the people that also ran, right? You have the people that are part of the system, because you can't have the races without the horses that lose. But all of those horses still have a vast amount of money spent on them. They all still have a significant amount of, in this case, we also have the majority of the people, just like the majority of the horses, are the also rans. For the people who don't make it to that extreme status, that star status, right? But we're the people that essentially are still grinding, are still hustling, are still working all the time, and just running and running and running and running and running and working our butts off to get to a place that we're still not ahead. And that's going to continue to get worse. In the economics lectures, I started you guys off with kind of explaining where America is, where the economy is, how the middle class is shrinking, why trickle down economics doesn't work. All of these things in that starting lecture to really get you to a place to understand that everybody is here. And then you add on to it the struggle of not having historical abilities to create wealth as white people did, white specifically landowning men, but we'll get into that too. Like we did in chapters 9 and 10. So really what this lecture was to get you back to here, where it's a personal account, where we're talking about student loan debt, where we're doing so in a much more personal way. And that's creating an entire generations, not just one generation, but generations of people who are sinking up to their eyeballs in debt. And it's not just those who went to school, right? This is credit card debt. This is housing debt. This is bankruptcy debt from a housing bubble that burst in 2007, 2008, and will likely do it again because the cost of houses right now is ridiculous. And we're looking at the same things. And the bailouts never come to the people. You will see politicians sitting up there arguing over your worth for Social Security, for social systems, for government assistance, for resources for impoverished people, for resources for mental health, for resources for education. All of these things, they will argue till they're blue in the teeth. But I guarantee you they'll shell out that money for every single next military advancement, for every single next weapon, for every single mass killing device. They'll do it for every single bank. They'll do it for every single major corporation. But they're not going to do it for you. Not unless we demand that they do. And part of this lecture, this is going to be one of those lectures where there's probably going to be a couple of them. This is going to be one of those lectures where you're going to look at me and you're going to say, Annie, you're consistently talking about having to take to the streets or take down the system. A, I will always preach that you need to take down capitalism. But B, I also want you to understand that without serious change and demanding serious change and demanding help with this student loan debt crisis, demanding help with racial wealth inequality, we will never get to a place that economically makes sense in this country. And we are not going to gain our middle class back by continuing to separate those who work from the 1% and continuously giving the resources only to the 1%. You're never going to create a healthy middle class. You're never going to create a healthy democracy. And you're never going to create communities being lifted up. And I say that because that's not what capitalism strives for. And we are fully realizing as America how much capitalism can push down the vast majority of humans. And that's also globally. And I'm not going to say that people in America are not better off than some other countries, because that is the case. What I will say is that there is significant amounts of wealth inequality and income inequality here in America too, at rates that should be downright devastatingly concerning. All right. Last thing I'm going to talk about is this idea of luck or social capital, and how that kind of impacts. And I kind of touched base on that with school, actually. So we'll get into kind of healthcare debt. Almost everyone in this country, besides maybe the top 20%, and that would still be a stretch to some degree for some of that top 20, that bottom part of that top 20%. I'll say the top 10%. That if they are one major health crisis, and some of them are just one minor health crisis, away from economic ruin. And I say that because our healthcare system directly impacts our economic capabilities. I say that because as a person who had a medically complex kiddo with a genetic condition that we could not in any way, shape, or form plan for, just one of her hospital stays, the one that she did at Cincinnati Children's, and she was there for 18 days with insurance covering 80% of it. Those hospital bills would have been $200,000. Say that again, $200,000. Now, obviously, I was a student in school. That was not something that was possible. I had the resources to have Kentucky Medicaid. If I had been like I am now, where I'm $1,000 over the essentially minimum for whatever the resource is, then here in the state that I live in, then I essentially, we would have had $200,000 worth of medical debt and been expected to pay that back relatively quickly. I don't know how many people have $200,000 worth of just free money floating around. And if they are, I would love for them to come, just like he talked about with Bezos and several other people. Zuckerberg, and I don't know, we call that up several people in that chapter, but they could wipe the debt clean easily, right? Or wipe a significant portion of it clean. We could have, government that aren't fighting to not pay for student debt crisis relief, right? And that's just a little bit that they were working towards now. The debt in this country will be something that will create significant issues in the next. It's already creating significant issues. It's going to put a financial and economic strain on this country that I don't know that we are prepared to deal with without really talking about massive social resources. And again, our nation's in debt to its eyeballs. So where we are going to get this, I'm not sure. But if the US doesn't start really thinking about specifically its student loan forgiveness, its racial wealth gap, its minimum wage, it's all of these economic measures don't get fixed soon, we are going to end up with yet another economic crisis on our hands. And that's where I'm going to leave this. Yay. But I hope that you guys are all having a good week. If you have any questions, or you want to talk about this, or you want to talk specifically more about any one of these ideas, or one of the ideas that he talked about, or have questions about what the Biden administration was trying to do, or how it will likely get struck down in the Supreme Court soon, please don't hesitate to reach out and we can talk about any of those things. If you want any resources on any other particular thing that I mentioned in here, please don't hesitate to reach out, and I can also find you some sources on that. So thank you so much. Have a great week.